Hear now the reading for Palm Sunday. This year, the Palm Sunday account comes from Luke's Gospel, from the 19th chapter. Hear this word. When he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village opposite, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' you shall say this, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So those who were sent away went and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of it." And they brought it to Jesus, and throwing their garments on the colt, they set Jesus upon it. And as he rode along, they spread their garments on the road. As he was now drawing near at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven, glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the multitude said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." But he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. There is an old story out of the days of the former Soviet Union. It's probably just legendary, but it's one of those stories which, if it isn't literally true, it ought to be true. It goes like this. A dissident in the Soviet Union one day gets so fed up with the government that he decides, as an act of rebellion, he will go out into the middle of Red Square in Moscow, which he does, and he puts down his soapbox, and he stands up on it, and he yells at the top of his lungs, "Down with Khrushchev!" The policeman who patrols that beat immediately goes over and arrests the man, and he is sentenced to prison for 10 years. During his time in prison, though, he has a change of heart, and he comes to feel that really Khrushchev is a pretty good leader after all, and he kind of gets behind him while a prisoner there in the Gulag. But what he doesn't know is that during his incarceration, times have changed. Khrushchev has been deposed and a new leader has been installed in his place. But when the man is released, he doesn't know this. And he decides, as they let him out of prison after his 10-year sentence, that the best thing he could do to get started on this new chapter in his life is make a show to everybody that he has been rehabilitated. So he takes his taxi back to Red Square, to the same spot, jumps out of the cab, and yells this time, "Hooray for Khrushchev!" Only to be arrested by the same guy. And as he's being hauled away for another 10 years in prison, he says, "But didn't you hear me? This time I said hooray for Khrushchev." And the guard reportedly says, "Sometimes, comrade, timing is everything." There's truth in that. Timing, sometimes, it's not just what we decide, but when we decide it, isn't it? Sometimes timing is everything, and Palm Sunday is a day about timing and the fact that even for Jesus, and maybe especially for Jesus, there came moments in his life when he was faced with a decision point that he couldn't stay neutral about. I mean, I think that's true for all of us. You know, sometimes life just requires our response. And how we respond and when we respond tells the tale about the values that really are central in our lives. For Jesus, the timing was now for him to go to Jerusalem and to face up to this brewing conflict. It had been coming to a boil for some time now. These religious leaders were kind of laying in wait, and he knew that. and he decided the time to come was at the beginning of Passover week, which many of you may know, thousands of people were coming to Jerusalem at Passover week. Historians think that in the first century, as many as 250,000 visitors, religious pilgrims and tourists, 250,000 would swell the population of Jerusalem, most of them going as a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. I want to go to Jerusalem at Passover. People still do that now, but back then it made Jerusalem just absolutely filled to the brim with people. And that's an important detail in the Palm Sunday story, because a city filled with religious pilgrims got the attention of the Roman authorities. Security was very tight at Passover week in Jerusalem. The Roman authorities always kept a careful eye on big gatherings of any kind because they were always kind of cautious. They didn't keep their power because they were foolish. They kept a careful watch to see, were there any dissenters brewing, any possible places where we might have an uprising? If so, we want to get ahead of the curve, and we're certainly not going to countenance any rabble-rousers. And so, with Jerusalem filling up, and the fear that there might be some potential for civil unrest, every year Caesar ordered that the local governor, who was Pontius Pilate, he was kind of the sheriff of that region of the ancient Near East. Pilate's job was to go up from his home, he lived on the coast in Caesarea Philippi, and to make a show of force in Jerusalem. He was to take with him a heavily armed, full military regalia, a brigade, a garrison of Roman soldiers. And he was to be there and to enter the city in a dramatic way. They were going to keep order as an adjunct to the local constables, but it was mostly as a kind of a statement of intimidation, kind of a warning to anybody who might be tempted to think they could, put out a soapbox and get up on it and yell, "Down with Caesar." Nothing doing. Not going to happen here. So it's an important detail because it makes it clear that there were actually two entrances into Jerusalem on the first Palm Sunday. It's important to know that. Entering from the west side, that's where Pilate was coming from, the west gate was this show of force and intimidation. The soldier garrison marching in, swords, shields, spears, Pilate on the high, the lip of honor, ready to intimidate anybody who might have any thoughts of insurrection. And on the other side of town, coming up from Bethany, the east gate, Jesus, in this act of courage and humility and faith, coming on a donkey. He didn't even own the donkey, had to borrow it. There are no weapons, palm branches, there are no soldiers, there are singing kids, and there are what Luke calls a multitude of the disciples. But again, it's likely that it wasn't all that many. I mean, after all, there are only 12 disciples, maybe a few other hangers-on. There's something called a preacher's count. You ask any preacher, how many people were at your gathering last week? They'll say a multitude. To say a multitude of the disciples, probably not a huge number gathered that first Palm Sunday. But it's interesting to know, and Palm Sunday, the entrance makes much more logical sense when you know what's happening on the other side of town at the same moment. In recent years, New Testament scholars, notably John Crossan, suggests that in coming to town in the particular way he did, Jesus was essentially giving people a choice as to which kingdom they most believed in and which one they most trusted. Do you attend the parade of Pontius Pilate, and do you trust the power of Rome, the power of force and the power of coercion, the power that elevates itself by pushing everybody else down? That's pretty much what the Romans did. I mean, they kept their power by making sure, by iron fist rule, that everybody else was subordinates. That's how they became winners, as everybody else was made to be a loser. That's what's symbolized in Pilate's entrance. The thumb is on you, still. You trust that power, or, Crossan says, Jesus gives them another option. Do you trust a power that's humble? Do you trust a power that's manifested in the donkey and the palm branches, which is a power of gentleness and a power of influence and the power of siding with the lowly and the outcast of the world, and a power that builds everybody up by coming alongside the weak at the moment when they need it, and bringing them up and helping them know they're children of God. That's why Crossan says Palm Sunday starts with a parade. It's our annual week to get to choose which kingdom we want to be a part of. It's a kind of an interesting dynamic when you think about it. As I read that, it occurred to me that maybe the closest modern parallel to Palm Sunday in our recent history of the last 100 years or so, when I think about what happened there and the choice of which side you're going to be on, I think about Martin Luther King's dramatic last week, his trip to Memphis in the middle of the civil rights struggle in the 1960s. Do you remember this? King goes to Memphis, Tennessee. Actually, it happened in late March, right about this time of year, last week of March. He went to Memphis, Tennessee, 1968 in March, in response to a cry for help from the city's sanitation workers. Do you remember this? And he walked straight into this showdown of his own. The background was that two of the city's sanitation workers had been tragically and senselessly killed 2 weeks earlier while they were trying to comply with a cruel and an oppressive workplace regulation that was directed at sanitation workers. The workers were killed when they were inadvertently crushed in a garbage truck, the trash compactor back of that. It was an accident, but the reason they were back there was there was a fierce rainstorm going on, and city rules forbade black employees to seek shelter from rainstorms anywhere but in the back of the truck where they were working. That was the only place they could get out of the rain. That was the law. That was the city ordinance. And those workers had been tragically killed because they were complying with that discriminatory law. And King had been asked to come. In response and horror of that tragic accident, the workers were considering a strike to get that rule changed, and King had been asked to come and to meet with them. And as they contemplated what to do next, the mayor refused to see him and declared the strike illegal. And the next day, as King was to address the workers and their supporters about what to do next, interestingly enough, there was a fierce thunderstorm, a fierce rainstorm, almost kind of an omen of things to come. But even in the bad weather, 2,000 people came out to hear him. And King took the podium. And of all things to talk about, he picks basically a Palm Sunday theme, a theme of timing and the fact that there are decisive moments when you've got to kind of stand up and decide which side you're going to be on. Specifically, he talked about God's timing and seeing how the important character decisions we make are far more important than the longevity or the length of days or years of our lives. He began by talking about some of the close calls he'd already endured in the civil rights struggle, and then he said this: "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And when I do, I'm happy. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." That was a part of his speech, and we all know what happened next. The following night, Dr. King was leaving his motel room about supper time, and the shot rings out from a rooftop nearby, and he was struck and killed with a bullet, 39 years old. There was an author named Dan McClendon who wrote a really good essay using a phrase from King's speech that night. "The Time Has Come" is the name of the essay, in which he reminds us that as King so aptly lived, there are basically two kinds of time in the Bible. There is regular time, what's called chronos time, the passage of minutes and seconds and weeks and years that just tick along, whether we are aware of them or not. That time just marches on, chronos time. And then there is, Clenendon rightly points out, something called kairos time. Those kind of unique moments in your life when you show the world the person you really are, the values that are really central to your life. God is calling to you, and you can't help but make a response. Clenendon says those moments, those kairos moments when God is urging you on even sometimes where you may not want to go, but where in the, the depths of your heart, your values are leading you. Those are the moments, the great moments of our life, when we have to decide yes or no. Those are the moments that define us. Longevity alone, he said, will be a sad substitute for having avoided those kairos moments when they're presented with us. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that when Jesus rode into town on Palm Sunday and on the week to follow, he forced a kairos moment on basically everybody who he came into contact with. The question, everybody has to decide in Palm Sunday, not just Jesus. Right from the outset, the crowd has to choose. Do I attend Pilate's parade or do I attend Jesus' parade? The Sanhedrin, the well-respected religious leaders, they have a choice. Are we going to press forward by escalating this conflict we have with him to a trial? Are we going to go forward with this sham of a trial and trump up these witnesses to bear false witness against him? Or are we going to give him a fair hearing? We have to choose. And we know what they eventually chose. Pilate, the Roman governor, Pilate seems to be the person who, of all people, would have all the power on Holy Week. But it's interesting, when Jesus is on trial before Pilate, though Jesus is the one who is in the defendant's chair and Pilate is high up on the bench, Pilate's kind of on trial too. What are we going to do with this guy? He doesn't seem to be guilty of anything, certainly nothing worthy of death. And then Pilate, you remember, brings Jesus before the crowd, not wanting to decide himself, saying, well, which one of these guys should I release, Jesus or Barabbas? And they choose, of course, Barabbas, leaving Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate says, I don't want to be part of this. You remember what happens? He washes his hands when the sentence of death is pronounced. To this day, we say, I've washed my hands of something. That goes back to Pilate, trying to wash his hands of making a decision about Jesus. His wife, do you remember? Pilate's wife had sent him a note during the trial. I've had a dream. Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I've suffered much over him in a dream. And I think of all things, Pilate would have wished more than anything that he could follow his wife's advice at that point. He wanted to sidestep the whole matter. It was distasteful. Crucifying Jesus, he saw no reason to do it, but the pressure was on. He had to choose. What will I do? We know the choice he made. It's interesting to think, too, though he tried to wash his hands of it, he's known only to history by that one choice. So we say it every week. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He came to be defined by that kairos moment and the choice that he made. It goes on and on when you think about it. Jesus on trial before Pilate at the same time. Peter's out in the courtyard, kind of on trial in front of that maid. You remember? Weren't you with him? I recognize you're a Galilean. Your accent betrays you. You sound, coming from Vermilion County, we're recognizable when we go, we people from the country, we go into town, they recognize us, Same for Peter. Weren't you with him? I recognize your accent. No, truly, I tell you, I don't know the man. And the rooster crows. To this day, you see weather vanes on barns and on houses. They're made in the shape of a rooster. That's not a deference to some agricultural symbolism. That's about Peter, right? His faith, fickle as the wind. He came to be defined by the choices he made. And so it goes. The rest of the disciples, will we stay with him or will we run for our lives? After Jesus is crucified, Joseph of Arimathea, who had been kind of a quiet, under-the-radar follower, had a choice to make. Do I go to Pilate and ask for his dead body? It's been taken down for the cross. I care about him, and I would like to put him in my own tomb. But am I brave enough to go and say, I would like to have his body, or I just stay quiet and let him? Most convicted criminals who were executed, their bodies were just thrown on the trash heap. That was the end. So Joseph of Arimathea had a choice to make too. That's repeated so often as the theme of what lies ahead that it strikes me. Jesus comes riding into the midst of humanity every year at this time and says, sometimes you just got to choose. Sometimes you can't be neutral when it comes to the great commitments that will order your life. Sometime back in a commencement address, David Foster Wallace, who taught here at ISU for a time, Wallace was not known as a particularly religious guy, but in a commencement address, he said something I thought was profoundly religious and profoundly Palm Sunday-like to a graduating class. Here's what he said. He said, "You know, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." And then Wallace went on to say, "If you choose to worship money and things, I assure you, you will never have enough. And you will always find yourself running on a treadmill toward the next thing you think will satisfy you. If you choose to worship beauty and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly, and when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths. You choose to worship power, and you will always feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power to keep your fears at bay." He went on to warn the graduates that you kind of slip into these kinds of trivial worship little by little and day by day. You don't even notice the choices that you're making. And that's why he said that the key to life is to be discerning, to choose what you worship, what you sacrifice for, what you live and die for, something authentic and good and important. It's up to you, he said. You get to decide. I think that's exactly the message Christ puts before us today. Palm Sunday's message is that Christ comes over the brow of the hill into our world and asks us, "What will you do with me? You know, what will you do with me? Will you love me or will you ignore me? Will you follow me or will you reject me? Will you claim me as Lord of your life or will you wash your hands of me and go your own way?" Palm Sunday is here, and we are at the kind of on-ramp to Easter, and we get to choose. And that is why on this day we welcome him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.